I just finished the Mistborn trilogy by Brandon Sanderson, and you want to know whether this would be a great series for you to read. So let's talk about it. This is going to be a spoiler-free video. However, I do want to outline some of the exciting things that happen in these books so you can make a well-informed decision on whether it's going to be right for you. And I just finished reading these three. So the first was called The Final Empire, but is now better known as simply Mistborn. The second, The Well of Ascension. And the third, The Hero of Ages. And the first question normally is, well, how long is this going to take? It took me a while. It took me a few months, so I believe it was about 3 months total to read these books. However, I was stopping to make predictions and YouTube videos and posting those predictions during that period of time. So a lot will depend on how much free time you have, how quickly you read, but I think that all of these could be gotten through within roughly 6 weeks or so if you were really motivated and excited to read them. So I've split this video down into several different sections to talk about some of the strong points of this series, and then I'm also going to talk about some things that I think maybe will make it not the perfect fit for you, and then you can decide at the end whether you believe it would be right for yourself. First thing I want to talk about is world building. The world that we live in this series, dreamt up by Brandon Sanderson, is called Scadrial. Scadrial is a totalitarian regime headed by the Lord Ruler for the last 1,000 years. And the Lord Ruler would have us believe that he defeated a great evil and saved the world from it. But as we already know, history is often written by the winners. So we have the ruling class underneath the Lord Ruler, and then we have the essentially slave class known as the Scar. Some big prominent things that occur in this world that separate it from obviously our reality is there is ash constantly falling from these ash mounds. There is also mist that comes of a nighttime and shrouds the world in mystery, and strange things happen in the mist. And this world, although it wasn't as deep as some other authors managed to create, it was nuanced, it was unique, and it was a very exciting world to live in for the duration of this story. So for the world building aspect, I don't believe that you will be disappointed at all. Next up is the magic, and I think this is probably the strongest part of this entire series and some of the strongest things that Brandon Sanderson is able to do, period. Now in this book, we don't just have one magic system, we have three. But because I don't want to give any spoilers away, I'm just going to talk about one, which is allomancy. Allomancy is the ability to swallow and burn certain types of metal. And if you burn certain types of metal, you are then afforded a certain power for the duration of the time that metal burns. For example, if you burn tin, then you are able to have enhanced vision and hearing and some of your other senses as well. If you burn steel, you are able to push on metals around you to affect them or yourself, depending on the ratio of the force and the size of that metal as well. One of the great things about this magic system is there's a cause and then there's an effect. It's very logical, and if something doesn't appear to stick to the rules, then later on it will be explained why. It's a hard magic system, which I know a lot of people out there really enjoy. So we have most people who's able to burn one of these metals. They're called mistings, and they have some other names depending on which one they're able to burn. And then occasionally someone comes along who can burn all of the metals, and they're called Mistborn, which is obviously the title of the first book. So they're quite important. Now, I actually think this system is quite complicated, but Brandon Sanderson makes it so that I was never lost at any point, even though there's 3 magic systems that overlap during this series. So there was a lot of opportunity to get confused, but he keeps it very simplistic and he allows me, the reader, to always know what's going on. And does this mean that there's some information dumps? It does. Is that the most eloquent writing? It's not. Does it allow me to know exactly where I stand for most of this story when it comes down to these complicated and fantastical magic systems? It does. And I think that's really, really important, because oftentimes you can get very, very lost in magic systems, and especially if they're as complicated as many metals as he has burning, and 3 different systems as well. So overall, I think it's a massive, massive positive. Probably the strongest part of this entire series is the enjoyment of the magic system. If you like hard magic systems, if you enjoy understanding them, understanding the implications of what somebody can do and how it will have a cause and effect on the world around you, this is the series for you. One more thing I would throw in there is, because of the logic behind the system and how well it was explained, I was able to make some pretty good predictions for the duration while I was reading this. And if you are interested in seeing those, basically what I did was I read each section of this book, and then I would hop on and make my predictions on what I thought was going to happen next. And Brandon Sanderson actually makes it much, I don't want to say simpler, but he allows you to be more secure in your guessing of what's going to happen moving forwards, because he doesn't break his own rules. Instead of breaking any of his own magic rules, he will create a reason why that has happened, and he obviously already has that in mind. Therefore, if anything, like I said earlier, feels like it doesn't fit into the system that he's explained well, it's because it doesn't, because there's a reason for that, and you're going to find out later. So very, 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 very good author to read and try and make some predictions moving forward of, which I always think is really fun. So what about the characters? I think one of the hallmarks of Brandon Sanderson's characters is smooth and entertaining dialogue. In what is an undeniably bleak world, Scardrial, where nothing really goes right for the common man or woman, he allows us to take a more light-hearted look at it because of the banter and dialogue between the characters that he puts forwards. So he creates this gang of individuals, and I'll go through some of them in just a moment. And their outlook on life, how they interact with each other, allows me to have a cheery and enjoyable experience, mostly when reading these characters, even though the tasks that they've set out are nigh on impossible, and it's a very bleak world as a whole. So another really strong suit is the dialogue between these characters. So who are some of our main characters? Well, a crew is formed, and Kelsier is at the head of this crew. And Kelsier is our Mistborn, our head of the team, and the person that everybody looks up to. He really is the muse for the first book. We also have Vin. Vin is a Scar girl, and if you remember, the Scars are essentially the slave class in this world. And Kelsier comes across Vin, realizes that she is able to burn all the metals, and begins training her. She becomes a staple for the gang throughout the rest of the story as well. And finally, we have Sazed. Sazed is a terraceman, who's a different type of person, and he is very obsessed with religion. He's looking out for Vin and really ensuring that those around him are looked out for. And he is one of an almost extinct race of people. And these characters are really fun. Not only do we have these characters, but obviously there's a ton of side characters, people that we meet briefly, and different types of creatures as well. And overall, I think Sanderson's character work is pretty good. The characters do go through some big development arcs, and it's not only our main characters, but the side characters, and some big development is made upon characters that kind of flit in and out of the story as well. So do I think that the characters is Brandon Sanderson's best work? No, I don't think so. I don't think that's the strongest point, but it is enjoyable. They are very lovable, and the development from some of them is absolutely incredible. So it's definitely not a weak point, but I wouldn't say it's his strongest point either, but that's just my opinion. Next up is creatures, and I can't go into a ton of detail because obviously I don't want to give away any spoilers, but we have a lot of really, really well thought out, well put together creatures that are non-humans in this story, that they all serve a purpose, they all are really well written, and they're all super unique as well, and none of them feel forced into the story. They all have very important moments throughout the story. I'm talking of the Steel Inquisitors. The Steel Inquisitors are the Lord Ruler's hands, so to speak, and they have steel spikes pushed into their eyes so they don't have any eyeballs. So they're very menacing sounding and looking creatures, and they're really the enforcer of the Lord Ruler. Very, very important. Then we have the Colossus, we also have Mistwraith, and we also have Kandra as well. And like I said, I'm not going to go into a ton of detail, but these creatures, how well they're used and how fun they are to read, are really a high point in this story. I absolutely loved each and every single one of them, and I loved how vital they were to the storyline and how well thought out their culture and their background was. And yeah, bravo to Sanderson for that. I think it's some of the best creatures that I've ever read in fantasy. So hats off. And one of the final things I want to talk about as a big positive is the pacing and the ending. Now the pacing is quick. There's something called a Sanderlaunch, which I had never heard of before, but upon joining the community after finishing reading, I found out it's what they call the avalanche of things that occur at the end of each of these books. And it's so fun to read. The pace definitely builds throughout each of the books. There's not really any dull moments. Sanderson is extremely efficient within his writing. And what I mean by that is the idea of Chekhov's smoking gun. It's the idea that if something is happening in the book, it is important, it's not irrelevant, and it will make an impact on the rest of the story. And I think Brandon Sanderson does this to the highest degree that I've ever seen in fantasy, and probably any writing as well. Everything that he talks about is important and pushing us in only one direction, and that's towards the end. He doesn't waste or meander or take side steps around what needs to be said. It's just very direct and takes us there, which some people absolutely love. So with the pacing being that good, the ending is absolutely phenomenal. And sticking the landing is something that's so hard for a lot of people in fantasy, because they build these fantastic worlds with so much detail, so many emotions tied into it, and to have a satisfying ending is really, really hard. You have some authors who widely people aren't impressed with the ending. An example for me would probably be The Inheritance Cycle by Christopher Paolini. I didn't particularly like the ending, even though I absolutely loved the worlds. It just felt quite underwhelming. And then there's some people who really just, we don't know what's going on with Patrick Rothfuss, for example, in the Kingkiller Chronicle, but the first two books are out. They are amazing. Maybe my two favorite books, but he just hasn't managed to finish it off. For whatever reason, he hasn't managed to finish it off. And maybe, I don't know, but maybe it's the depth of the world and the perfection of what he's built, but maybe he didn't have a strong ending in mind when he began and doesn't know how to tie some of these things up. I don't know, but Brandon Sanderson, I do know, is the opposite. It's very clear that he had a very, very clear vision of what was going to happen, how it was going to happen, and then he worked backwards and tied everything together. And boy, does it tie together really well. Absolutely amazing. One of the best endings you'll read in fantasy. So those are a lot of reasons why you should read this series. And I will never advocate for someone not reading the series, but there are some things, as always, that aren't to my personal tastes. And don't get me wrong, I absolutely love this series. It was so much fun to read. I never really had any dull moments, but there are some things that I would change. Now, I do miss some of the beautiful writing that other authors are able to give. And although Sanderson creates something beautiful, I don't think that the parts, the sections, the sentences are anywhere near as beautiful as some other writers are able to do. My first example, having just trashed him a little bit in the last section, is Patrick Rothfuss. Patrick Rothfuss brings beautiful language to his stories. And by beautiful language, I mean he crafts these sentences with so much care, and it just feels beautiful to read. It feels like you're reading a work of art. Each sentence, each paragraph, the way things come around, it's as close to perfect as I can read. And obviously not everyone's going to stack up to that, but with Brandon Sanderson's very direct and efficient way of writing, I think a lot of the beauty comes from how well crafted the storyline is, rather than how well crafted he has made the sentences and paragraphs of that story, if that makes sense. I also prefer Joe Abercrombie's style. He is a very, very slick writer when it comes to dialogue, and it creates poetic, moral, and immoral circles throughout the course of the literature, meaning that every single conversation feels like movie quality. It feels like Ocean's 11 when you're watching that. Like, the whole point of that movie really was the dialogue between the characters and how slick and smooth and, again, poetic or immoral it was. And just the lessons you can take and the circles you can pick out from the dialogue is the book. Like, that is what makes it so fun and exciting. Whereas, again, with Brandon Sanderson, it's very direct, and he's very focused on fun dialogue, and it is good. It's not bad dialogue, it's good, but it's fun and it's direct and it's a means to get to the end, in my opinion. Another reason why it may not be your favorite series when you read it is the world building. The world building, what he has, incredible. But if he had wanted to make this 5 books, maybe it would be a little bit better. If he had wanted to make this 6 or 7 books, it could be even better again, because we would have been allowed a little bit more detail, a little bit more time to understand the cultures that are in there, and to explore some of the subplots and sub-storylines to maybe give us an even higher payoff. But that's just not his style. He has managed to fit it all in 3 books. And I even remember, I can't remember which book it was, I remember him doing like a preface for the book explaining why it was important for him to get what most people do in 10 into 3. And of course, you can't have it all. You can't have efficient, fast, fun storyline, and then also the depth like a series like The Wheel of Time has in its world. It's not possible. So again, I loved this series, absolutely incredible. But if you're looking for the deepest world and something you get completely lost in, you know, maybe this might not be the right one for you. Yeah, having said those 2 things, and again, don't get me wrong, I loved this series. Those aren't meant to put you off. It's just to explain why maybe it won't be your favorite when you read it. But I know why Brandon Sanderson is so popular. And not just Brandon Sanderson being popular, I know why this series, the Mistborn trilogy, is one of his most popular series that he's written. It's because he takes a complex world, he takes complex characters and a complex magic system, and he also takes an interweaving and complex storyline, and he makes it so simple. He makes it easy to understand, he makes it fun to understand, he makes it so you're not lost, except for when he wants you lost because of the mysteries that need to be unveiled. And that's why I believe he is such a successful author, and why this series was so good to read. So if you've already read this series, or if you're thinking of reading it, go and have a look at some of my other videos where I was reading it for the first time and making some predictions. I'd love to have you along for the ride. It was so fun to read. But you tell me, what do you think? Where does this rank in some of your favorite series that you've ever read? Do you agree with my points on what you think Brandon Sanderson's strong suits are, and what you think maybe aren't his strong suits as well? Please like and subscribe. I'll see you on the next one.